What's up, everybody? Thralls here once again. I'm the Croc Nick, and I am back with a segment that I have not done in a while. Definitely had multiple reasons to bring this one back, one of them being that John keeps bringing up the fact that I do these segments at the end of every video, and I haven't done one in a while. But the main reason is I like doing these segments, and this is a chance for me to talk about bands that lurk on the fringes of metal, or are metal, but I don't know, there's some debate about whether or not they're metal, or they're flat out not metal, and they just have a heavier sound. So yeah, this is bands that are heavy but not metal. And I got a good mix of different stuff on here, some stuff that is a little bit more hardcore related, some stuff that is maybe a little bit more geared towards like proto-metal or classic rock, and two bands that have released albums this year that are extremely polarizing to the whole metal world. And we're gonna go over one of them right out of the gate, and that is Ghost. Pretty much since this band's inception, I have heard this band pretty much just discredited as not metal right out of the gate. The complaints about their image not matching their sound, the poppier hooks, and so on and so forth. For me personally, I've always considered this a metal band, but it's, more of like classic heavy metal and, elements of hair metal, but also 80s pop. And honestly, the 80s pop thing kind of draws me to it. But calling this band not metal, I think kind of puts like heavy metal and like hair metal and pop metal like a little bit under the microscope. And baseline, I'll say if Ghost isn't metal, like throughout their entire career, then what about Ozzy? Because Ozzy and Ghost have a lot of similar tropes in terms of their songwriting. Now, I don't think anyone's arguing that Ozzy isn't metal. I mean, he's like the godfather of it in a way. I mean, Tony Iommi too, of course, like just Black Sabbath in general. But Ozzy's solo career, if you kind of break down the songs, and it's throughout his entire career, his songs are based on pop rock structures, or like pop structures. They're, big chorus hooks, big melodies. The big difference is that it's a little bit darker, and of course you get like big riffs throughout, and they're catchy, and I mean, he's always a caliber guitarist, soaring leads, all of that shit. But if you break it down, Ozzy wrote pop songs for fucking metalheads. Now, granted, they have definitely changed around their sound over the years. Like those first three albums in particular were a little bit more dark, a little bit more like centered around Black Sabbath, Blue Oyster Cult, Queen, Scorpions, and maybe a little bit of King Diamond, which, I mean, a lot of people said that they were a King Diamond ripoff, which is weird because if you're calling them not metal, then why even bother comparing them to the King? But it was around prequel, after all the lawsuits and such, and all the firing of the nameless ghouls, that Ghost really shifted over towards like that more pop-centric sound, where it became kind of the thing that was just like right out in front. Well, they still incorporated like their spooky melodies and such, and like rich guitar harmonies. It definitely had a more pop-centric sound. I mean, prequel spawned Dance Macabre, which is pretty much ABBA goes Spirit of Halloween. The songs like Rats and Faith have that old school kind of like heavy metal feel to it. Again, very comparable to Ozzy Osbourne, where you have like giant vocal hooks and just these big solid riffs. And that's continuing on with their last two albums as well. You kind of get that same formula again of like these big heavy riffs in more pop-esque songs. And the thing that, again, like kind of keeps me coming back to calling them a metal band is if you kind of break it down to their more metallic elements, namely like the guitars and leads and solos and such, they have a metallic feel still. Those harmonies that they play don't sound out of place on an Iron Maiden album. They wouldn't sound out of place on a fucking Scorpions album, anything like that. They're still rooted in classic heavy metal overall. Then the themes are still very dark. Granted, they're very glitzy and catchy and built around soaring choruses, but I mean, it still has that darker flavor to it. So yeah, I say this band is a flat out metal band. It just happens to be like a metal band that some people don't like because it feels too cheesy or too, I don't know, light and airy and fluffy or something. I don't know, like adjectives that are not used to describe metal, and I think that kind of just, it irks some metalheads. But personally, I like this band. I don't even give a shit. I think this is also a really solid gateway band in terms of like getting into metal. Like this is a good first step. You're gonna hear a lot of classic metal tropes, and it's not like Five Finger Death Punch or anything like that. I would much rather like newbie metalheads get into Ghost before they get into Five Finger Death Punch, because the only thing Five Finger Death Punch will lead you to is like, I don't know, domestic violence and parole violations. All right, next up is a band that I've been listening to since my teen years, and I've always kind of just considered them hardcore, but again, throughout their entire discography, there are moments where you could argue that they kind of traipsed on the metal boundary, and that is Sick of It All. New York hardcore elites, honestly, one of my favorite New York hardcore bands, period. While this band's roots are firmly in hardcore, metalheads seem to fucking love them, and I really wouldn't call them necessarily metallic hardcore. Like, these guys, you know, only kind of like flirted with it a little bit. A lot of their stuff is straight up hardcore. But this band's career path early on put them in, you know, kind of like lockstep with a lot of metal bands. They toured with metal bands. They weren't exclusively on hardcore labels throughout their entire career. In fact, they made a jump to like some major labels, East West at the time. That was Pantera's label. And Pete Kohler's riff work wasn't always just rooted in, you know, like punk and hardcore. He definitely incorporated a lot of metal riffs. Now, the self-titled EP and Blood, Sweat, and No Tears, I would say, are like firmly just straight up hardcore. Like, a lot of the punk roots were showing right there. There's not like anything on there that I would consider like flat out like metal as hell. But when you get down to albums like Just Look Around and Scratch the Surface, you can definitely tell there's a little bit more of a metal influence on them. Honestly, Just Look Around, like you put that like side by side with like a crossover thrash album like, you know, maybe SOD or even something a little bit more modern like, you know, Municipal Waste. There's a lot of stuff that kind of lines up. In fact, the only time I ever saw Sick of It All, they were on tour with Municipal Waste, and I mean, they're playing a lot of the same riffs. They kind of have a lot of the same energy. But songs like Shut Me Out and Never Measure Up off of Just Look Around, they have like thrashy machine gun riffs. You get those driving D beats. Again, those are, you know, definitely a hardcore trope. But the way they're being played, there's a fierce, like, kind of metallic crossover energy on there. And Scratch the Surface, I mean, you could argue that might be their flat-out metal album right there. It's a little bit groovier. They actually were listening to more metal at the time, I believe, when it came down to like the influences on the album. There's definitely still like punk geared songs on there, but there's a lot of stuff on there that, I mean, honestly, don't sound out of place on just like flat out metal albums. Even the guitar tone kind of had a more, I don't know, like metallic crunch to it. Lou's vocals kind of changed around a little bit. Like he was doing some stuff that, I mean, it was a little bit closer to what Phil Anselmo was doing, but I mean, again, it's kind of that gray area. You could argue what Phil Anselmo was doing was also kind of hardcore-ish. But for the most part, I would say this band kind of balanced out their albums. Like for every like more metallic kind of groovy song that they would have like a short, punky, just down-picked fucking banger that, you know, was just for the hardcore kids too. Now this band did have a period where they kind of slipped into like, I don't know, like more just punk related stuff. It was when they signed with Fat Records. Built to Last, Call to Arms, Yours Truly definitely were more punk centric, but then they made a jump to Century Media and started releasing some of the heaviest stuff of their career, where you could definitely say there's a lot of metal kind of worked in. Death to Tyrants and Based on a True Story in particular, I mean, there's a lot of metallic riffs on there and just more metallic hardcore energy. But all the arguments aside, honestly, I still wouldn't call this band a metal band. It's always kind of a flirt. Like, you know, you'll have like a fiercely metallic song that just reeks of like thrash metal, and then you'll go right back to like the more punky stuff. And even like later on, you'd have like some more like flat out oi punk songs, which admittedly, I fucking like them. They're fucking fun. But I love this band's heavier side. But if I was to say which albums definitely had a more metallic vibe, and if you were looking for the more metal side of this band, Scratch the Surface, Just Look Around, Death to Tyrants, and Based on a True Story definitely have a lot of their more like heavy metallic side showing. All right, next up, another band that's more in the hardcore scene that is very near and dear to my heart. And I don't know, there's some arguments that could be made here too. Bad Brains. One of the pioneers of the whole DC hardcore scene. Their debut album is honestly one of the best fucking hardcore albums to fucking ever come out. They were tough to classify right out of the gate. While they had all that fierce hardcore energy, there was a complexity to their sound that just wasn't showing up in other bands. Like even like Minor Threat and like Black Flag did not have the crazy riff structure that Bad Brains had. They also didn't have the flat out insane all over the place vocal delivery of a guy like HR, who sounded like he was going through manic fits of rage behind the microphone, and then, I don't know, kind of like squeakily crooning reggae and going into these screaming fits. The band's vocals were frantic. They were like loaded with nervous energy, and they made these songs fucking stick. I think the first song I ever heard by them was Pay to Come. Hard to forget a song title like that, but I was absolutely entranced with the crazy guitar work. And you know, at that point, even on that first album, I heard stuff that reminded me of the thrash metal that I was listening to. But it wasn't enough for me to actually say, like, oh no, this is actually a metal band. You know, the production was more raw. It had that punky, very, like, you know, tinny sort of tone. Granted, Dr. No would throw in, like, lead work in there, which lead work is, you know, I mean, in punk, it's not a thing that shows up very often. The most I could say about it was, like, I could definitely see, like, early metalheads getting into this and incorporating it into something like thrash metal or crossover. But after their first two albums, that's where it gets interesting, at least for the sake of this discussion, because the two albums that came out after that, Eye Against Eye and Quickness, you could argue those are groove metal, funk metal, almost even like proto-nu metal in a way, because there's a lot of stuff on there that, you know, I feel like bands like Deftones or like System of a Down kind of like listen to and like, yeah, let's take elements of that. Or even in some of the more funk-laden moments, you can hear stuff that is very similar to, you know, Living Color or like Fishbone. The stuff that stuck out to me in terms of like this discussion were songs like Reignition, where you'd hear like a lot of these like syncopated riffs, you'd hear more double bass play, a lot more groove and like kind of like hardcore leaning groove. And that got pushed even more on Quickness too, like songs like Voyage to Infinity. You would hear stuff that, again, lined up more with metal than it did with punk. But this band was hard to classify anyway. You know, for all these metal moments and punk moments, you would also have, like, you know, flat out reggae and dub moments too. And even in their more metallic moments, it was kind of hard to peg them as like a flat out metal band, like in terms of a particular style. Like, you could say funk metal, you could say alt metal or whatever people were calling bands like Faith No More at the time, but it wasn't like consistent across the entire album because it would keep jumping around because this band was wildly experimental. Now I am still missing some of the stuff that followed Quickness, namely Rise and Gotta Love, but I did get their comeback albums, I guess, because I mean they kind of came out relatively close. Build a Nation and Into the Future. And both of them are more along the lines of like the first two albums, again, like more punk centric, and then you get their like reggae sound too. But in terms of the more metal side, I feel like that was kind of left behind. And, you know, if I was going to make an argument that this band was metal, it would be specifically with Eye Against Eye and Quickness. It's not across the entire catalog. Regardless, this band is absolutely amazing. Like, again, wide reaching in terms of styles. Dr. No, I really feel that that dude is a super underrated guitarist. His lead work is both, you know, noisy and fucking scathing, but also incredibly tuneful. And while I wouldn't call this band a metal band flat out, that dude knows how to write some metal riffs. I mean, listen to songs like Sheba, got You Choose with a Quickness. There's flat out metal riffs on there. So overall, I wouldn't call this band a metal band, but I also feel like this band is like an essential listen for metalheads because this band definitely helped with the evolution of the sound. And there's key ingredients I feel that they contributed that kind of branched out metal into these fun, weirder spaces like funk metal, nu metal, alt metal, whatever. All right, next up, another band that I've been listening to for a long time, and I would hear this band called metal by people that didn't listen to metal, and I would hear this band called emo by, people that listen to metal. And to a degree, both were right, at least early on. That band is Thrice. I have been a Thrice fan since, I believe, their second album, The Illusion of Safety. I still love that album. While I'm not a big fan of Dustin's earlier vocal style, being that more emo bleeding style, riff-wise, these guys love metal. They definitely fit in that emotional hardcore, post-hardcore, I don't know. I mean, it's the stuff we called emo back then, and I mean, it kind of fits, like image-wise, you know, album art-wise. I mean, this band excelled at having album covers that screamed, I sound like Radiohead, and then sounded nothing like Radiohead. That was like the emo aesthetic, though, to be fair. But early on, again, I kind of struggled calling this band emo, mainly because I didn't want to because I liked them. And most of the emo bands that I had heard kind of annoyed me outside of like a handful. But I really struggled with this one because it was clear on their first three albums that they had a love for metal. Lots of Iron Maiden harmonies, lots of flat-out thrash metal songs. Identity Crisis, The Illusion of Safety, and The Artist of the Ambulance are loaded with flat-out metal riffs. And the first two in particular definitely kind of lined up with that more like metal-leaning punk, bands like Propaganda, much the same, Strung Out. Well, I would definitely call those bands more punk-leaning. They clearly had a big love for metal. Some of them kind of turned into metal bands because, I don't know, like that last Propaganda, I feel like there's more metal on there than there is punk. But those first three albums, even they admitted they had a lot of influence from like Metallica, Iron Maiden, etc., and you could 100% hear it. And at points, I would call certain songs like flat out fucking, metal songs, like Hoods on Peregrine in particular. There's just great fucking metal riffs on that song. But after The Artist of the Ambulance, things started changing and we started getting more post-rock, post-metal stuff. Vishu, which I think is a standout album of theirs, is completely unlike anything that they had released before that. And this is where you started hearing elements that honestly kind of lined up with Deftones. I would even say like, Cult of Luna or Isis at points. Granted, not quite as heavy, and this band also incorporated a lot of folk and blues at this point, but there was a heaviness to it that, I don't know, like you could almost call kind of post-metal. And this kind of kicked off like an experimental run for this band because this band became harder and harder to classify. Even now, I'm not entirely sure what I would call them other than like alt-rock, but occasionally you have elements of post-hardcore that get in there. I don't know. But when they did their Alchemy Index series of EPs, it was clear that this band was not going to be pigeonholed in one particular genre. Each of these 4 EPs were centered around an element, fire, wind, water, earth, and they all had a distinctly different sound. And the fire one is honestly one of the heaviest things this band has ever put out. Probably one of the sludgiest tones they've ever had. The songs were definitely more aggressive, but they slowed down, actually stripped out a lot of the punk elements. But it was still done with like a ton of melody and, big vocal hooks. Even Dustin's vocals kind of changed at that point. They became more gruff. I believe he actually suffered some vocal damage from all the screaming. That's why he doesn't really do it that much anymore. But in a way, it kind of gave him what I see as just like a better vocal approach. Like I like this more raspy sound that he has now. But a lot of the stuff that followed the Alchemy Index EPs, you could argue is kind of comparable to the bands like, Cave In or Baroness. Well, I don't know if I would call Cave In a flat-out metal band. I would call Baroness one. But as far as calling this a metal band, again, this is one of those bands that definitely had like a period where they were pretty damn close to metal. But, I mean, if you called them metal back then, someone would say, shut up at Screamo, and you'd probably be like, I suppose that's fair. Even at their heaviest, I still couldn't necessarily call them like flat out metal because they had a lot of other elements in there. And even early on, like it seemed like they were kind of like on a little bit of an island. Like, I knew a lot of the emo kids were like, oh no, I'd much rather listen to like, Dashboard Confessional because they speak to my feelings more and they're not screaming at me. To which I would usually respond, I would rather listen to nothing than Dashboard Confessional. But playing this band for metalheads, even with their earlier stuff, yeah, no, they'd hear the vocals like, no, Screamo, out of here. But I'll also say if you only listen to their earlier stuff and haven't listened to any of their stuff, more recently, like their last handful of albums, go check them out. It almost sounds like a completely different band at this point, and I think they're honestly writing some of like the best, like, I don't know, like hard rock. I don't know what necessarily to call it because it feels heavier and more earnest than a lot of the bland ass rock that's fucking on the radio or streaming right now, but it still doesn't sound specifically metal. They have an album coming out next month. I'm fucking stoked for it. I don't know if we'll do a full-on review, but you bet your ass I'm gonna fucking talk about it in a collection update if I get it. All right, next up, and we're going into a 90s obscure band that, I mean, if you've heard of this band, awesome. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone bring up this band. And that band is Brutal Juice. So way back in the 90s, heavy music was getting weird, like getting very experimental. Lots of boundaries got blurred for the sake of experimentation in the 90s, and that's how we got bands like Melvins and Butthole Surfers and, all that crazy shit. Well, I would say like a tier down from them was a band called Brutal Juice, which was this weird, like post-hardcore, heavy alternative, just kind of bonkers, weird band that was just kind of impossible to categorized. The band kind of like leaned into that more like Butthole Surfer sort of approach where the songs were noisy, experimental, possibly maybe written on like an entire sheet of acid over the course of like a week. Now, it's hard to find any of their earlier stuff. Like I even searched around on YouTube and there's very little about this band on YouTube. And in terms of streaming, the only thing that I have found is the fucking album that I own, Mutilation Makes Identification Difficult, which was actually on Interscope Records at the time. This band actually broke into the major labels somehow by just being strange and weird. And, you know, back in the 90s, major labels would do that. They don't fucking do that now. They make safe bets like you. You sound like you're just going to sell a fucking million albums or get a billion streams or whatever. You're poppy, you're safe, you're auto-tuned, you're fucking hired. That's major labels now. Back in the 90s, they were like, well, you're all drug addicts and musicians. Sure, sign here. Hell, we'll even give you a massive events, which we really hope you won't spend on drugs. Anyway, Mutilation Makes Identification Difficult is probably the album you're going to find the most out there. But they do have some other albums out there if you can find them. Their debut album from 1991, How Tasty Was My Little Timmy? That's a fucking really creepy album title. Or 1994's I Love the Way They Scream When They Die. Also creepy, but somehow less creepy than the Timmy one. And this band even did come back for a little while in 2016 with an album or an EP called Welcome to the Panopticon. But describing this band's sound, it's sprawling, it's atmospheric, you get a lot of weird atonal guitars. It almost feels like a homogenized blend of like just weird 90s bands that, again, were heavy but not specifically metal, like, you know, Jesus Lizard, you know, stuff like that. Maybe a little bit of like Acid Bath and Primus kind of world together. I know Acid Bath is 100% metal, but I don't know, like they have that sort of like darkness where it feels like they were just talking about, you know, skipping through a field with like serial killers and shit. But it would also have like these more cosmic trippy moments like fucking Monster Magnet too. They were definitely heavy. Like the opening track on Mutilation Makes Identification Difficult is what's called Kentucky Fuck Daddy. It's pretty hilarious, but it's got like some absolutely menacing riffs and these like descending weird melodies and such. And again, you got vocals that are kind of sung, you got screams coming out of nowhere, but you also have like songs that do kind of generate like, you know, kind of grunge-esque post-grunge hooks like Burp Gun, The Vaginals, that's hilarious, and Nationwide. All these songs are kind of like oddly catchy. And that weird experimentation and just their songwriting, like it doesn't feel like it's geared towards like, you know, radio play or like commercial success. This band wanted to be strange. Like chord progressions are just bonkers on this album. A lot of their themes, if you can guess by the song titles, were definitely more irreverent or dark. Like songs like Curb Job, Cannibal Holocaust, Lashings of the Ultra-Violent. They wanted to show off their darker side, but at the same time, it never quite became like full-on metal on that entire album. Even some of the later stuff I listened to, like, it kind of stayed in this just weird kind of grungy space where, like, yeah, it sounded a bit like, you know, early Smashing Pumpkins, but it sounded like Smashing Pumpkins if they liked, you know, acid instead of heroin. Maybe calling it like psychedelic grunge / post-hardcore, that might cover this band. They're just sort of like this weird anomaly that just screams 90s. And I strongly recommend anyone that just likes weird music, like, again, so like Primus and fucking Butthole Surfers and Jesus Lizard and shit like that. This is a band that is 100% for you. But in terms of calling them a metal band, I would say no, but it's definitely heavy. It's definitely weird. And yeah, if you can find any of their albums, just go ahead and get them. All right, next up, a band that I'm just going to go, you know, ahead and say point blank, they're non-metal, but I think relevant to the discussion about proto-metal, is Boston. Now, I'm a huge fan of Boston's first two albums. I mean, I think a lot of people are a big fan of, you know, Self-Titled and Don't Look Back. Those are mainly the two I'm going to talk about because, I mean, right, Third Stage had Amanda. I'm kind of just annoyed by that song by now. And then everything else, well, I mean, it's kind of hit or miss. But those first two Boston albums, I think, have some significance in terms of the, you know, proto-metal discussion, namely because of production. Tom Scholz, I mean, dude's a fucking genius. The dude is just brilliant as hell. Actually, a Toledoan. He was born here in my hometown. I don't know if he brags about that. I wouldn't. But in terms of like production and sound and like just the sound of guitars in general, Boston was kind of a game changer. I remember years ago, listening to like my mom's classic rock station, and we would occasionally bounce back and forth between like the more current station, which it was the 80s station at that point. And whenever Boston came up, it felt more akin to the more modern sounding bands at the time on the 80s station, like the, current stuff. And a lot of that was due to these big, rich guitars that had like a little bit more of a crunch to them. Tom Scholz was a hell of a musician and multi-instrumentalist, but he was also, a really solid sound engineer. I believe he went to fucking MIT for it. But a lot of Boston sound came from like his research and his development of, different equipment out there to get this rich guitar sound, which, I mean, when you compare it to a lot of like 70s bands of the era, they didn't quite have that metallic crunch. Like this kind of had like a little bit of what I think would become like the tone of a lot of like, heavy metal and like, hair metal bands and such. Like it had just a different vibe. Like I would even say like this was almost like a precursor to like, Eddie Van Halen's tone. And musically, I feel like, the band definitely toyed with some heavier moments. Like, Smokin', I wouldn't call it like a aggressive, like, fuck you anthem or anything like that, but it definitely has like a certain energy to it. Brad Delp's vocals, like he's almost like in that same caliber as like Ian Gillan in terms of like a 80s wailer style, like, definitely a guy would say that definitely influenced that. This band also loved a ton of fucking harmonies, and if you break down a lot of their harmonies, I mean, it's very similar to, stuff that would show up in heavy metal later. And in terms of contemporaries, like, right up there with like, Thin Lizzy, Kiss. But in terms of like even their heavier moments, they were always brighter. Like this band loved big melodic hooks. You had, just soulful ballads. You had like anthem songs. You had songs that were a little bit more proggy and experimental, but the tone of Boston was never like super aggressive. And even in terms of like the earlier metal bands and proto-metal bands, again, like Thin Lizzy, Black Sabbath, early Judas Priest, there was like a tinge of darkness to it, where Boston was, I mean, they're pretty much like all fun party songs. And again, in terms of like production and sound, I do feel like this band kind of contributed to heavier music overall. Like, I mean, you can even go as far as like saying Weezer kind of embodied a lot of what Boston did, except they were nerdier about it. So I'd say like the main argument, at least the main reason I brought them up, is namely production and tone and sort of changing the overall sound from that 70s sound to the 80s sound. Much like Van Halen, except Van Halen, I think, definitely did it in a more metal-centric way. But again, if you listen to Boston's guitar tone, like that's a tone that I think is associated with more like heavier acts later on. It became more refined, it became thicker, it became bigger and meaner. But I think that tone is kind of like a root moment there in heavy music. So yeah, 100% not a metal band, and I'm a sucker for solid hooks, and Boston just knew how to fucking do it. All right, next up, we're staying in the 70s here, and this is a band that, I mean, well, I don't think a lot of people really know about, but I think like the old school metalheads and the old school classic rockers might remember, and that is Dust. Dust were a short-lived New York band. They only put out 2 albums. Their self-titled album in 1971 and Heart Attack in 72, which some people actually know that one a little bit more, namely because of the fucking Frank Frazetta artwork that's on it, which is fucking awesome. For 1972, that is a very metal-centric cover. Like, I'm surprised Molly Hatchet didn't get in a fucking fist fight with the band over that one. But this band arguably kind of had a proto-metal sound. Like, it was very much in line with, I would definitely say Black Sabbath, and to a degree like Deep Purple, Blue Cheer, stuff like that. But I think probably the most well-known thing about this band is their drummer, Mark Bell, went on to become Marky Ramone, and their bassist, Kenny Harrison, went on to be a session bassist and played with a lot of well-known acts, namely New York Dolls, Hall & Oates, Billy Joel, Joan Jett, and even Foghat. But Dust definitely had like a darker, more aggressive sound overall. It wasn't uniform across the board. Like, they definitely had their ballads. Heart Attack, despite how like, mean looking that cover is, there's a lot of acoustic play on there. Really well done, clean vocals, but very intense drum work. Lots of those like proto heavy metal gallops, like, big Thin Lizzy vibes, Rush. I would even say like Mountain and Budgie are almost kind of comparable too. And despite how like tuneful some of the songs are, or, tonally a little bit softer, like where it's more acoustically driven. The themes were decidedly darker. They were more menacing and more occultish at times. Like if you listen to the song Thusly Spoken off of Heart Attack, that song, is very soft and very, I don't know, like whimsical sounding, but when you listen to the lyrics, like, oh no, you're talking about some pretty dark shit there. Now, much like Sabbath and, a lot of the proto-metal bands, there's a heavy blues rock vibe to it. And tone-wise, like, you can hear kind of that, like, scratchy sort of fuzziness to it. And that is really apparent on their first album. In fact, there's a lot of, like, Texas blues kind of worked in there. There's even, like, some slide guitar and Going Easy. But the thing with this band is, I can't say, like, universally they always had this heavy sound. They would kind of go back and forth between, something that is decidedly more like a blues rock boogie with, like, cleaner guitars, or something that's a little bit more ballad driven. And even their heavier side wasn't always like a more like proto-metal sound. Like sometimes it was just a good hard rock sound. So unlike Black Sabbath, I would say they weren't as committed to like a heavier tone overall, but they definitely had their moments. The song Dry Camel in particular off of the first album, huge Sabbath vibes. It's longer. It's got some really solid riffs in it that, honestly wouldn't sound out of place on an album by The Sword or maybe even High on Fire. The vocals would sound out of place in a High on Fire album, that's for sure. You get heavy metal gallops, the riffs are darker, like you can really hear that proto-metal sound on there. And I gotta give a lot of credit to Mark on drums. He really does propel a lot of these songs. His drum work is particularly intense. Like this is kind of like proto-metal drumming. You can hear that on a lot of these songs. Pull Away So Many Times, Learning to Die in particular have been like just a lot of intense drum work that, again, is more associated with like, metal than say, just straight up classic rock. So as to whether or not they're like metal or not, I mean, honestly, you could make an argument that this is like straight up proto-metal. Like, I don't think they're as metal as say like Black Sabbath, but I don't know. I mean, over the course of 2 albums, they might have been consistently more heavy than say like Thin Lizzy. For the early 70s, I would definitely say that this band was heavy, and granted, I don't think we had a word for it in terms of calling it, heavy metal or anything like that. If we did, I think this band probably would have been called metal. So by that, I'm comfortable calling this band proto-metal overall, but, I still urge you to check it out. Like, this band, for the 2-album run they had, both albums were really fucking good. All right, next up, this is a band that got brought up a lot over the course of me doing these videos. And I wanted to actually like sit down and like really listen to this band because honestly, outside of a few songs and well, a project that's loosely tied to this band because it shares the main member, I have never actually sat down and listened to full albums by this band. And this band is Tad. Now, before grunge became decidedly more commercial and well, a fucking fashion statement, the earlier run of grunge bands definitely had like a heavier kind of like darker, more twisted sound. Again, Melvins, you had bands like Seaweed, Green River, and even early Nirvana too. They had a more, raw kind of like punk driven sound that was kind of somewhere between punk and metal at times. And debatably, out of all of those bands, Tad might have been like one of the heaviest. They definitely had a much heavier sound than I would say a good chunk of the entire Seattle scene. Like even debatably heavier than Melvin's overall. And their sound wasn't just like heavy and weird. Their sound grew more and more metal as they went on. Their first full-length, God's Balls, which is an amazing name for an album, kind of walked this precarious line between groove metal and like noise rock. I think bands like Helmet, Unsane, but also like early White Zombie, like, I mean, the shitty White Zombie, honestly. Not saying that their stuff was shitty, it was definitely more refined. Maybe Jesus Lizard is a better comparison there. But the band had squawky riffs, bellowed vocals. The guitar tone was squawky, noisy, but it was thick and chunky as well. They deliberately pushed for something that was a little bit noisier and more unapproachable earlier on. And a lot of their stuff was based on like a heavy bass line, kind of like chunky riff, and then playing like a lot of weird atonal stuff while Tad himself just bellowed and ranted, and it just created this like nervous, uncomfortable fucking energy as well as some like heavy fucking riffs. But as they went on, their sound became a little bit more refined and a little bit more focused on like heavier riffs without all the like atonal noise. Like they were kind of trying to write like some hookier songs, but they were doing it in such a way where they would still say like very heavy, like, it started sounding a bit more like early Clutch too, where you had those gravelly, weird vocals that, Neil did early on. But the riffs became more metallic. The tone became more metallic. And by the time you got down to albums like Eight-Way Santa, which has an amazing story about that album cover, not the one with the band on it, but the original album cover. And then later, Inhaler, these albums, I mean, honestly, I would argue that they're metal albums. You get more heavy syncopation, more double bass grooves. Like there's stuff on there that is, more akin to like, prong. I wouldn't say like full on like Pantera, but it feels more in that groove metal sort of vibe. Maybe even Propane. The vocals will often, kind of go back and forth between like more gruff, gravelly, I wouldn't say like necessarily growled vocals, but they're definitely more aggressive. To stuff that is like a little bit cleaner and a little bit more accessible, but their sound overall became a lot heavier and a lot more focused on these like syncopated grooves. You occasionally have like some more accessible songs, like ones that kind of fit in the grunge pack a little bit more. Because this band was on a major label and they were still trying to push for singles. It's just, I feel like, some of their decisions kind of hampered them. Namely, the story behind Eight-Way Santa was kind of a big hiccup there. But going over like all their stuff, I honestly would argue this band was more of a metal band than, say, just a grunge band or like an alternative rock band, whatever the hell you want to call it. They kind of fit in the whole metal category a little bit better. Hell, they kind of sounded more metallic overall than like Helmet at points. Like before they broke up after their last album, Infrared Riding Hood, I would compare this band to bands like Scissor Fight or, definitely Red Fang. Actually, Red Fang and Tad sound decidedly similar when it comes down to like songwriting, the vocals. And to me, Red Fang is 100% a metal band. So yeah, honestly, I could flat out call this a fucking metal band. Like there's honestly more fucking metallic tracks on here than I think there are like more alternative or like just like noise oriented tracks. Dude, Greasebox, Bullhorn, High on the Hog. Yeah, pretty much everything from like, I would say like Salt Lick all the way to Inhaler. I feel like that material in particular is very metal centric. Infrared Riding Hood definitely has a lot of heavier moments, but it still kind of feels like it's balancing out their sound. And God's Balls is definitely like maybe a little bit more noise rock, but overall, I think this band was low-key a fucking metal band that, I don't know, just kind of didn't quite fit in the pack and just did their own thing. Sadly, this band isn't around anymore, but I know Ted Doyle, the main guy behind Ted, was doing a project called Brothers of the Sonic Cloth for a while. They put out one album, at least as far as I know, they put out just one. They might have put out more. I don't know. Hopefully he's still doing stuff because I really like this dude's work. All right, next up, I'm kind of diving into a weird band that I haven't really sat back and listened to for a while, and I was like super all about them in like the mid-2000s. We are going to talk about Horse, the band. Now, way back in that whole period of the mid-2000s, I remembered hearing the term nintendocore get thrown out, and I was like, what the fuck is that? And the answer was this band. Someone played me this band. I believe it was the song Birdo, and it opened up with the whole Rankin Bass Gollum going, eggs. Then I started hearing like 8-bit fucking keyboard parts and weird like dissonant guitars and D-beats and ranting vocals. I'm like, holy shit, this is a fucking weird fever dream. But apparently 8-bit music has its own thing where it's called chiptune, and I did not know that term existed until I was actually looking up information on this band. But it was that mixed with post-hardcore, some mathcore, because there's definitely like some spazzy, crazy stuff in there. And this band was just absolutely insane, like very comparable to like, Converge, Every Time I Die, Genghis Tron, like especially their earlier work, like not counting the last one. The last one's kind of its own animal, but the two full lengths in the EP that preceded that last one, oh yeah, no, very similar. And maybe even like a little bit of that eclectic, weird BT band sort of sound too. Now, I only own 3 of their albums, The Mechanical Hand, A Natural Death, and Desperate Living. And trust me, there's enough in those 3 albums to really make an argument that this band was maybe a metal band. There's definitely a lot of like metal like song structure in their stuff. Like, you know, a lot of the stuff was very spazzy but very complex. Like it kind of goes beyond just like straight up hardcore, even if they did have like Nintendo sounds going on, which the songs did have like some video game themes to their credit. Like Birdo is legit about that egg barfing pink creature that you run into in Mario 2. There's even comic book references. A Million Exploding Suns on there is about the Sentry, which we now know him from the Thunderbolts movie, but in the comics, he's a lot fucking darker. Or even just like fun random stuff like Sadler and Waldorf, like they show up at the end of the album just to say that it wasn't good. But the music itself, again, it kind of has this like weird, almost kind of like prog metal, kind of avant-garde sound. Like, you know, the song structure isn't necessarily always very contemporary, even though they do have like good chorus hooks every now and then. Like, you could almost describe this as like prog for the Warped Tour generation. Like, this kind of falls in line with bands like Fall of Troy, maybe even Coheed and Cambria, but like maybe Coheed at their weirdest, maybe. But I'll argue A Natural Death in particular, that album definitely had more metallic riffs. Like, you get like good Machine Gun kind of thrashy riffs that show up in the songs. They're faster. There's pockets of blast beats on there. Songs like New York City and The Red Tornado, which is about the DC Comics character. Again, you know, themes are all over the place. They definitely have like a more metal sound overall. But when you get down to their last full length, Desperate Living, they kind of ditched the nintendocore thing and started doing more, I don't want to say like traditional synths because they still sound very weird. But it was less of that 8-bit sound overall. Like, it was kind of scattered on the album. And the songs themselves became way more elaborate, way more proggy. And that kind of like all over the place nature of the band, it really got more experimental with those last two. Like songs like Sex Raptor. It's a flat out fucking synth pop song. So tonally, this band is still all over the place despite being bone crunching heavy on one song and then absolutely fucking silly on the next one. So basically this band doesn't really fit neatly kind of anywhere in any particular subgenre. Even they dislike the term nintendocore, and I suppose that only goes so far with them because, I mean, I kind of agree with their sentiments on, you know, Desperate Living, where it's not, you know, a nintendocore album. Honestly, I'd call it almost a prog metal album with a lot of punk influence. But across the board, I would still say this is very heavy and at points very metallic, though again, I'm just not really sure what to fucking call them. Even in both like hardcore and punk and metal, like this band kind of eludes labeling because they're so fucking weird. Or at least they were. I guess they've been broken up for a while, but they reunite for shows every now and then and go back to being broken up. But in terms of calling this band metal, I don't know. Like, I feel like it's kind of reserved for certain songs mostly. Like, if I had to pick one album that felt a little bit more metal than others, A Natural Death definitely has like a more metallic vibe overall. But in terms of like calling this a metal band across the board, I would still probably say no, though again, heavy, but more strange than anything else. Like, this band kind of thrived on being weird and just explosive and kind of just all over the place, and mission accomplished, or at least mission accomplished for a while there. And finally, the last band I want to talk about, and another one that came out with an album this year, and one that I'm sure I'm going to irritate, you know, someone with because I'm talking about them again, and I probably have yet to say anything nice about this band. We're going to talk about Sleep Token. Not necessarily because I wanted to, but I feel like this is just one of those bands that's kind of part of this conversation, and I hear it debated by metalheads and even the fucking fans of this band. Anyway, let's have it out. In full transparency, I fucking listened to the other two albums that I had not listened to by this fucking band. And that would be Sundowning and This Place Would Become Your Tomb. I own the Eden one that I fucking hate, and that's the only album I'll ever buy from this band. And we reviewed their most recent fucking Turkey, which honestly, I can't remember the title of. Maybe I've actually kind of done like that whole memory thing where you block out traumatic memories, and now I can't think of it. Or maybe I just didn't write it down. Either way, I've listened to all their stuff now. I committed some fucking time to this one so I can make a judgment call as to whether or not they're metal, and it is no. Even going back to their earlier stuff, which, you know, some of the fans said, oh, you gotta check out the earlier stuff, it is a little bit heavier. And they were right by saying it's a little bit heavier. They do have songs where, you know, I would say like the guitars are a little bit more the focus, and when the guitars are heavy, they are these deep, down-tuned, you know, just like very Meshuggah-esque guitars, but the riffs only occasionally felt metallic. You do get some harsher vocals that do show up, and again, like some more metallic-like energy that does kind of come up on, I think it's Hypnosis was the song. I don't know, I can't read my writing. I'm never gonna listen to these songs again, so, you know, whatever. But most of the stuff is soft as hell, and when it's not dick writing Meshuggah riffs, like fucking bare bones Meshuggah riffs, like they are the most basic fucking things. When it's not dick writing that, it is dick writing Imagine Dragons. And for the record, if I ever hear a Sleep Token fan dog Imagine Dragons, that is entirely too much fucking irony for me. But again, like I went into this, like, all right, I'm gonna look for like some of the most metal stuff in here, and it doesn't necessarily scream that. You know, the atmosphere itself, whether it's all the synths and keyboards, which are there, or the fucking vocals, which sounds like fucking Elmer Fudd's Vinegar Strokes, or like a deaf guy trying to sing fucking like the Smiths or something like that. It's just not for me. And the whole Vessel thing and their story arc, yeah, I'm gonna continue to make fun of this band. Even his look, he looks like a sexualized praying mantis in a bathrobe. I just don't get it. But here's the thing, like, you know, when we did the last review, we definitely brought up whether or not this band was metal in that review, and even the fans seemed divided. First, there were just some that were just flat out pissed at us because we were making fun of their new favorite band, and I was like, you know, whatever. But there were some saying that they were an evolution of metal and they were transcendent, and, you know, this was like forward-thinking, almost progressive metal, to which I laughed. I'm pretty sure Shred laughed. Anyone I told probably laughed too. But there were some that argued they weren't a metal band, and they even brought up the fact that this new album has less metal moments on it. Like there are less moments where the guitars are super present, or they were doing like more metallic drum sections. In fact, a good chunk of the drums felt like they were electronic, but you know, whatever. So even within the fan base, it feels like it's divided. And honestly, I don't feel as though like the heavy moments complement what they do. Like they might just be better out just like stripping out like the heavier sections and doing the fucking, you know, Spirit of Halloween fuckboy music or whatever it is. But yeah, even at their heaviest, I'm with those fans that say that this band is not metal. I just don't really see it. In fact, much like people were saying on the last album, the heavier moments don't necessarily feel like they belong there. They feel like they're forced because that was an aspect of their sound, and they feel like they have to include it now. So yeah, I can confidently say I don't think this band is metal. I can also confidently say that I don't like any of their albums, but I like all of their albums more than their last album, which I think is probably the worst one so far. And that will do it for this video. And honestly, this was a lot of fun to go back to this one because I like talking about these bands on the fringe. Even to a degree, I liked talking about Sleep Token, only just to make fun of them for a little bit. But I might do another one of these in the future. I got some other stuff that I'm working on too, and, you know, kind of slowing down on the collection update thing for a little bit so I can work on some different segments. But if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We also have memberships. They're only 99 cents, and our lone perk is doing a members only live stream, which we will probably do, I don't know, it depends on when you see this. Maybe you see this in October, maybe you see this in September. But if you see this in October, we're probably planning on doing another members only stream. Either way, membership's the main way to support the channel now, and there is a button down there that says join, and you can just smash the living shit out of it and join up and become a member. And of course, thank you guys so much for liking, subscribing, following, all that shit. It means the world to us. Tons of content coming our way. We have now moved past At the Gates finally, and we are on to Immortal next. I'm fucking stoked about that one. Also, October is going to be loaded with probably a lot of huge releases. Hell, there's plenty of big releases in September too. We also have some other discussion videos we're working on too. So yeah, tons of content coming your way. So one more big thank you, because you guys are awesome, and we will catch you later.